All right, today we're going to take a fresh look at the positive side of ADHD, but we're going beyond the usual headlines. We're going to dig into what the actual science and research tells us. So let's get right into it. So you've probably heard this phrase thrown around a lot, right? The idea that ADHD is some kind of superpower. It's a really appealing story. It suggests that, for all the challenges, there's this hidden set of amazing advantages, like incredible creativity or endless energy. But is it really that simple? Well, according to some really interesting research from Martine Hugman over at Radboud University, it turns out that while a lot of adults with ADHD definitely have positive traits, that whole superpower story, even though it's well-intentioned, can be a little misleading. It just paints this black and white picture that doesn't really capture the full, complex reality of living with ADHD. And this quote right here, it just hits the nail on the head. The real key is to find a balance. The point isn't to ignore the good stuff, not at all. It's about seeing it all in a realistic context. It's about seeing the complete picture, not just the highlight reel. So if it's not about having superpowers, then what is it about? Well, the research points to one absolutely crucial factor: context. You see, a trait isn't automatically a strength or a weakness. Its value, well, that depends entirely on the situation you're in. And here's a perfect example of how that works. Let's take a trait like high energy or being really dynamic. In the right setting, like a startup that needs someone to kickstart a new project with a ton of passion, that energy is a huge asset. But in a different context, say a long-term project that demands slow, steady focus, that same exact trait might lead to getting bored and leaving things unfinished. Same trait, totally different outcomes. Okay, so let's dig into the science and see how this all holds up. Researchers didn't just guess about these positive traits. They studied them systematically. And the first thing they did was simple. They just asked adults with ADHD to talk about the positive sides they experience in their own lives. And from all those conversations, 5 big categories started to pop up. People talked about their strengths in social areas, like feeling a lot of empathy. They mentioned being flexible, having that dynamic energy we just talked about, cognitive things like hyperfocus, and of course, creativity. This gives us a really great starting map of the positive side. But, a good scientist doesn't stop there. They always ask the next big question. Can we actually measure this? Do these strengths that people are reporting actually show a statistical link to ADHD symptoms? This is where the research gets really, really interesting. And the results are pretty fascinating. The hard data shows a real positive link between ADHD symptoms and traits like hyperfocus, high sensitivity, and cognitive flexibility. But, and this is a big but, other traits people often talk about, like enthusiasm or perseverance, they did not show that same statistical link. This is so important because it helps us separate what feels true from what the data actually shows. All right, let's drill down into one of the biggest and most talked about traits: creativity. Now, the connection is definitely real, but it's way more specific than most people realize. It's not necessarily about being a better painter or musician. It actually comes down to a very specific style of thinking. Okay, so check this out. It really boils down to 2 different kinds of thinking. Research consistently links ADHD to something called divergent thinking. That's the ability to brainstorm and come up with tons of different unique ideas from a single starting point. But it's not linked to what's called convergent thinking, which is all about finding that one single correct answer to a problem. And this is a really important point. We're not just talking about big artistic projects here. This divergent thinking often shows up as everyday creativity. Finding a clever workaround at your job, seeing an unconventional solution to a problem, or just MacGyvering a fix for something broken at home. It's practical, real-world innovation. So what does all of this actually mean for someone's day-to-day well-being? Well, this is where all this research really connects to the bigger idea of neurodiversity. The concept that all these different ways of thinking and processing the world are just natural variations of being human. And wow, is it a popular concept? Around 75%, a huge majority of adults with ADHD feel really drawn to the idea of neurodiversity. It gives them a framework for accepting themselves. But, and this is a really big but, there's a catch. So even though they love the philosophy, they're very clear that they don't want it to replace their actual clinical diagnosis. And why is that? Well, it's pretty simple. That diagnosis is often the key to getting the support they need, things like therapy, medication, accommodations, and they are, understandably, really afraid of losing access to that care. And all of this leads to a really powerful and super practical idea called strengths use. See, it's not quite enough to just know what your strengths are. The real magic happens when you actively identify them and then figure out how to apply them in your daily life, both at work and at home. And get this, the data on this is incredibly compelling. Studies show this really strong link between people who consciously use their strengths and better mental health. We're talking lower levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. Now, we don't know for sure if one causes the other, right? But that connection is just undeniable. And that right there, that really brings us to the most important takeaway of all this. Forget the generic superpower label. The real power is in self-knowledge. Truly understanding your own unique cognitive profile, both the good stuff and the challenging stuff, that is the absolute essential first step to building a life where you can actually thrive. So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. It's not about whether your traits are good or bad. It's about finding the right playground for your brain. So ask yourself, in which contexts, in which jobs, in which relationships can your unique traits shine the absolute brightest? Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer.